So welcome to another episode of Leadership Live podcast. I'm really excited to have Dan Frechtling here with us. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Daphne. Great to see you. Great to be here.
Yeah, and you. And just a little bit about Dan. Dan is the CEO of Boltive, providing publishers and advertisers the tools they need to monitor and audit their programmatic ads, securing them against invasive media, setting a new standard for accountability and protection that our industry desperately needs. And this is what we're going to be talking about today because we all want to know more about this really important topic. Dan has led B2B SaaS businesses since 1999. He was president of G2 Web Services, acquired by Verisk, where he expanded G2 cybersecurity solutions to detect brand-damaging activity and transaction laundering. He was also GM at Hebrew, VP at Stamps.com, Senior Associate for McKinsey. He has an MBA with distinction from Harvard Business School and a BS with high honors from Northwestern University. Awesome achievements and even more stories to share, but you can follow Boltive on LinkedIn and Twitter. And we are really, really excited to hear what you have to share with us today, Dan. And before we dive into the topics of cookies and opt-ins and cybersecurity and all of that, I know that you have a really personal and heartbreaking story to share with us. And I'd love to start off with that, if you can just share a little bit about what you've been through over the last couple of years.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Daphne. And when you go back and we look at the experiences we've had in life, it's the surprises and sometimes the traumas that we really learn the most from and that cause the most change. And that's why I enjoy your podcast, because you explored those issues with others before me and some really good stories there. I guess what I would like to start with is to talk about loss. And most people don't like to talk about loss. I don't like to talk about loss. But
yeah, it's a tough topic. It's a tough topic.
Yeah,
and it's something that we put in the kind of denial bucket. It's not going to happen to us kind of thing.
Yeah, it's true. But when it does kind of strike us, you're really only faced with one decision, and that's how to move forward. And I don't want to depress us for an hour. This is not going to be a tale of woe, but loss is something we all face. We all face it, and we face it sometimes when we least expect it. I want to bring this up, and I want to take you back a little bit because years ago, the worst series of events that ever happened to me were a string of miscarriages that my wife and I had. And when you go to the doctor and you get that ultrasound, and it's usually a wonderful experience. When you see that doctor's expression change and there's silence and there's no heartbeat, you go through something that's very difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
With that story, we had about 3 miscarriages, and then we ended up, fortunately, afterwards with 3 wonderful boys, but it was a trying time. And once we got through that period, I can remember my wife, Annie, and I would say to each other, where do these guys come from? With 3 wonderful boys, we're family went from 2 to 5, right? And now we're dealing with the challenges of 5 in a world built for 4, car seats and hotel rooms, theme parks and all those things. We were really grateful.
So Dan, were they triplets? That's the question.
Yeah, that would be overwhelming.
Were they very close together, or?
Yeah, we have so one. I have one oldest son, and then twins right behind him that are about 2.5 years. That are 2.5 years younger than him, but they're close enough. They're 2.5 years apart.
So that was the surprise bonus.
That was, that's right. And the fact that they were all boys, we thought the odds were in our favor. We'd have at least a girl. But so life was going well. But then 15 years later, my wife had back pain, and we saw the doctor this time, and with an MRI instead of an ultrasound. So then there's that experience, right, of going in and seeing, what the imagery tells you, and it actually turned out to be stage 4 cancer.
Wow.
And so we faced that loss together. But during that period, Annie was my model of resilience because she suffered through all the progression of cancer with grace, with optimism. Wow. She was given 4 months to live, and with some treatments, she actually made it 18 months. And then there was that moment, right, just like years ago when you're in seeing that ultrasound and the heart stops beating. Well, I was there for that moment when my wife's heart stopped beating also. And that was kind of the moment where you got to realize you move forward. And our family of 5 became a family of 4. Again, my 3 boys and I.
How old were they, Dan, at the time?
12 and then 10. So the oldest was 12, and then the youngest were 10. And so what do you do, right? You loss doesn't give you a choice. And fortunately, the story doesn't end there. That I will say there was a complication, which was this happened right as the pandemic was ramping up.
Wow.
So we had that to contend with too. Wow. But I bring that up because many of your listeners will have faced losses of various kinds, and there's a well-known YouTuber who says, if your life is grand and everything's great with your family, just wait 6 months, which is a very, very pessimistic thing to say. But the point is, everybody goes through some kind of loss, and sometimes they're family loss, friend loss, sometimes they're business losses, and overcoming that loss and rallying, I think, is a key success factor for leadership. So what you can do is you can't undo it. You can't control Z, but you can control N. You can create something new. And I think ability to rebound from loss, any kind of a loss, is a strong trait and a secret weapon really in life.
It's amazing to be able to sit on the other side of that and just, you describe your losses and you've had a few along the way and you kind of just saying them, but I almost want to take a moment and just absorb the impact of what losses like these can actually mean to people, because it's amazing to be able to step back and say, we can learn from loss and move forward, understand how it contributes to our growth or resilience or whatever the lessons are, but at the same time, just the immense sadness of it. And I suppose also a question of why me? Why do I have to go through one thing after another? Haven't I paid my dues on this in this area? So maybe just to honor that for a moment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, that's really a kind of a profound statement to make. And as I think back in some of the other guests you've had, Chris and Molly Maxwell, they went through something extraordinarily difficult where Chris was on a ventilator for 15 weeks, right? And they didn't know if he was going to come out of that or not. And then to hear about how he's now running half marathons, right? Yes. There's all kinds of stories out there of people who deal with shocks like that and find their way through it. For me, it was different than that. It was, okay, what do you do now when you and your kids lose mom? Yeah. And your partner in life you're without. And so you go through all kinds of self-introspection and you realize you have two lives. And the second life begins when you really, really deeply understand you only have one life.
Tell me about that. Tell me about that comment. What does that really mean, that you have two lives and your second begins when you realize you only have one? Just explain that to me.
Yes. So some of this is like Zen and Stoicism and the great philosophies of old, but making the most out of the time you have and really, really understanding that every day, not to waste a moment. Annie didn't waste any moments with the time that she had left. And I try to do that too. So for me, it was like, first of all, I had a whole bunch of responsibilities I never had before. So I never really learned to cook. If it sounds funny, right? But I never really. Yeah, Annie was a wonderful cook. And now I'm not anywhere near what she was. I'm very different in that. But I learned how to feed my kids, right? Because that's fundamentally one of the first things you've got to do. I had supportive family and friends going through this. So I don't want to make this sound like it was about, my heroism. I was far from perfect during all this time, but I had the support. And Annie had such a wide circle of friends that came in and kind of descended on us and helped us. We were really blessed with that.
Amazing.
So, but then the pandemic hits, right? And so then what comes from that? And interestingly, my boys and I were now at home together 24/7, every moment, right? Wow. Annie was a stay-at-home mom, and I was always the breadwinner who went out to work. Well, now I was a stay-at-home dad and a stay-at-home working dad. Yeah. Everybody was stay-at-home really at that point. Yeah. But it created this bubble for us, for the four of us, to get to know each other in different ways, right? And I learned about them, they learned about me. We all learned about resilience. And kind of back to your question about what is it about realizing when you only have one life, that one of the early things that really made a difference for me was understanding that emotional and mental strength comes from physiology. And I think back with your podcast, Erin Kendall Braun talked about that. She went through an awful health experience where she had mono while writing her dissertation, and she has permanent health impact from that. But she does things with her physiology, her sleep, her exercise, her diet that puts her in a much better position. Well, that's what I did too. And for me, it started a little different. It was getting up early, doing some kind of workout. And for me, that was a fail-safe for any kind of level of stress. And that's a habit that I maintain too. There are some other things, and I'm not perfect with these, but I would say intermittent fasting has worked for me.
Yeah.
And also understanding how neurochemicals influence you was a big deal. When you wake up every morning and your brain is full of cortisol, that stress hormone, that's why so many times we wake up in the morning dreading the day. And it just takes a little bit to shake it off, and just a little bit of movement, a little bit to shake it off, to realize it's just a neurochemical working against you. So I think
that's interesting. That's interesting. Kind of realizing that there's some things that are just physiological, chemical, neurochemical, and you can do something to mitigate the impact of that, the chemical reaction.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot you can do, right? And cortisol is one of them. I think for me, the big one was dopamine, and realizing that when I was drinking alcohol, especially after the loss of my wife, that I was flooding my synapses with dopamine. Okay. And over time, that leads, to excess, that leads to the loss of dopamine receptors in your brain. Well, the good news is you can stop drinking and you can restore all of that. And for me, it was about cold turkey, no more drinking at that point. And that's made a big difference from a physiological and chemical standpoint too.
So that's interesting for me. I think that there is the neurophysiology, but there's also is it a mindset or something external sometimes even, that all of a sudden makes you realize, hold on a sec, I need a change. Something needs to change here. So whether it's getting into the habit of some movement first thing in the morning, or stopping a habit of alcohol drinking every single day, what is that moment of insight or realization that makes you change?
Yeah, it oftentimes it takes a traumatic or dramatic experience to do that. New Year's resolutions aren't enough. We all know that, right?
They don't work. I do talk about this. I don't know if you know, but January the 17th is called Ditch Your New Year's Resolutions Day. Because by that time, most people have ditched their New Year's resolutions because it just doesn't happen.
I wonder if it used to be the 27th, and in this world that we're in right now, shorter attention spans.
Maybe exactly.
I did not know about the 17th. That is remarkable. So you find those moments with children. This kind of goes back to what my kids were going through, right? Children have a lot of neuroplasticity. Adults don't have as much neuroplasticity, the ability to change and react and just reform your associations and way of thinking around the circumstances that you're in. But when a shock hits you, any kind of shock, like some of the things that we talked about in your podcast, then you can take advantage of that, and you can use it to spur change. And so for me, for years I thought, I shouldn't be having a drink every day. That was the moment where it was actually relatively easy, because of everything else that was going on, to flush that habit, to shed that habit completely.
Amazing. So I have just a point of curiosity, and then I would love to hear about how you dealt with the loss and running your business. Sure. And kind of what that means for leadership. But my thing of curiosity is just something that you said about your wife, Annie, was given 4 months to live, and then it turned into 18 months. And sometimes when I think about it, I also had a kind of near-death experience, nearly lost my life after the birth of my third child. And I do speak about that as well in my podcast. I'm not going to go into it, but I sometimes do sit back and wonder, because I often reflect about death and loss and what it means. And I think when you're given 4 months to live, mine was a surprise shock. I gave birth and then immediately went into crisis mode. But when you're given 4 months to live, what happens? Do you want to drop everything and just use every moment to be together? What happens in your mind, in your brain? How do you approach that kind of a deadline? Do you believe it? Do you not believe it? I'm curious about that. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but
it's a gigantic change, of course, right? We go through different periods in life when you want time to speed up or slow down. Mm-hmm. And I can remember, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but when our twins were born, and we were doing night feedings, and one of them had reflux and was crying all the time, and those times I wanted time to speed up.
Let's get this over with. Right? When's the next date?
I get into 2, and then I just want to forget about everything, all the sleepless nights. But of course, when you're given 4 months, it was really. Statistically speaking, it was 4 months. The doctor didn't say you have 4 months. It wasn't like in the movies, but statistically speaking, without the treatments that are available today, targeted treatments for cancer. So She had non-small cell lung cancer, which is lung cancer for people who don't smoke. And it stuck up and it was immediately stage 4. But we had no idea how long we had. It could have been anywhere, could have been years. But back to what you said, time slows down. You want time to slow down. You want all those moments. They say when you're in a car accident or something else that's sudden, that your frame rate actually increases. Yes. And that's why everything seems to slow down, because your visual, your acuity, everything is capturing more, right? We have a frame rate in our eyes, just like the screens that we're looking at have frame rates. But this is for an extended period of time. And it was, how do we slow these moments down? And how do we help the kids treasure these moments? Because they're not hearing everything that the adults are hearing. They're not knowing the prognosis and the treatment changes and until you really need to tell the kids, hey, we don't have much more time. But it's a mindset change. Sometimes you want life to speed up. Sometimes you want life to slow down. And then someday you get older and you realize you just want everything to slow down and you want to reverse it if you can. Right? But I guess just some other things to keep in mind that really helped me is that in many trying times, your worst day is somebody else's best day. This is something that Dan Martell is another person I've listened to on the internet. But there's people around the world who are living through hardships far greater than what we have. Like, and having that perspective, visiting the world, seeing developing countries, seeing people suffering, learning about what's happening in the world that we want to shut out. That's another thing, that the worst day we could be having is a day that others could dream for, and being grateful for that. Is another key insight, I think.
That's also, Dan, just an absolute gem, what you've just said, because I think we might know this, but to actually come from an experience like yours and to be able to step back and say this and really live this is just an inspiration, and something we really need to kind of take in these words, because you've lived it, and that you're able to step back and have this perspective, I think is just awesome, really.
Well, I credit my kids too, because they do things that beyond what I do. They volunteer at Camp Sparkle here in the Seattle area, which is a camp for families and for kids that are going through the same cancer journey they went through. And so my kids are counselors and junior counselors. So finding a way to turn it around and not just be grateful, but to share your experience in some ways. And
turn it into something meaningful, to give some meaning to it. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So almost seems a sharp segue into kind of talking about business and leadership, but I really do think you have a lot of incredible stuff to share with us. I'd love to hear maybe just a little bit how this loss impacted your leadership and your business, and how you translated some of those experiences.
Yeah. So Daphne, I think it's at some point, since I've been trained in business, I've always had a career in business. So at some point I was going to go back from, dealing with the recovery and the getting through the grief back to, the other part of life and earning a living. And I developed an interest in data privacy. And the reason was that I was the victim of invasive, creepy ads during this cancer journey. When seeking out treatments for Annie, I saw that my browse history, the sites that I'd visited, was shared with online ad vendors. And it's called data leakage. It's in the US, it's called surveillance advertising, and maybe other markets in the world, it's surveillance advertising has made it into the legislation. And having also been a marketer from my career, it really turned around my view of marketing from thinking it was about hyper-targeting and getting closer and closer to that holy grail of knowing your consuber, to realizing there's a lot of snooping and prying that just doesn't belong.
Yeah. And in really personal, vulnerable moments, you're being targeted.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And exactly, being targeted with those cancer ads. Some of them were humorous or trying to be funny and trying to be cartoonish. It's just not what you want to hear when you want to take a mental break and go read about sports or go read the news, right? So those things made a big impact on me. And I also had the opportunity to help a friend who was also dealing with a family member with similar lung cancer. So I joined my current company, Boltive, and It's a mission-based business. It is a for-profit startup, but it's also a mission-based business, which I strongly believe in. My prior company, G2, was about finding bad actors in e-commerce. Boltive is about finding bad actors in online advertising, including privacy. So I've talked a lot about my personal story, but I think if we step back for a second and look at what's going on in the world, what was going on in the world around the same time, right? And what has happened over the decades. If you look back in the origin of cookies, right, we all know what cookies are by now on our browsers, but
we do. And it is just those things that we go, I accept. I don't know what I'm accepting, but I just accept them, right? Because if I don't accept them, I won't be able to go onto the website.
That's right. Yeah, we do that without thinking. And there's a journey that got us there over the years. And it was, in the UK in 2011, it was the hacking scandal with UK newspapers. And then in the US in 2013, it was the Edward Snowden incident where he was sharing about how the NSA was gathering information on people. Equifax in the US in 2017, there was a hacking that was later attributed to the Chinese military. And then in 2018, there was Cambridge Analytica, which was believed to have influenced elections from that. And even to today, where, again, back in the kind of US perspective, but this is happening all over the world. But in the US in particular, we had the Hobbs decision, which took away, it reversed 50 years of precedent on privacy for women's health, for abortions. So we're kind of in this world where the amount of understanding of data that's gathered around us just through these incidents has risen. And we're seeing a convergence of regulations around the world that's very, very unprecedented. So Japan amended its privacy law in 2017. GDPR came into effect in the EU in 2018. California passed a law. In 2020, Brazil passed a law. China passed a law, I believe, last year. India is introducing a new privacy law. So when in the US, we have our first national privacy law that's been tabled at the moment. So there's just a massive amount of change. And what's really interesting is that when you look at regulations in most countries, they target a particular sector at a particular time. So I'll go back to the US example that in 1887, that was where Congress created the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, just for railroads. And that was the first time we ever had regulation. And then since then, the US and other countries around the world, we have nuclear regulation, we have electricity regulation, we have auto regulation, airplane regulation. But what's happening in the world right now is quite unusual because this is multinational. It's not just one country at a time. It's around the world, these global regulations at the same time. And so we haven't seen an industry have to change as quickly on a global basis to keep up. And it touches on fundamentally other things that are changing the world, like artificial intelligence and where there are privacy issues, children's protection, big tech, and the rise of these gargantuan technology companies. So you ask how I got into privacy, and it was my own experience and a desire to turn it something good out of that. And maybe change the world in a positive way, but it's far greater than I. It's really where the world is going right now, in a change, in a swing of the pendulum.
Amazing. And you mentioned that you started it because of your own personal experience and the link to a mission-based business. And I think that's so important because you are so driven by purpose to make a difference, create something different, do something in this world that is, as maybe as cliched as it sounds, but will make it a better place. So maybe this is a good segue into, tell us why CEOs need to be putting this on their agenda. Why is this a top concern for CEOs of businesses?
Yeah, so at its core, it's really a few issues. It's that data privacy and data security is under much greater scrutiny than before because of all these regulations that are taking effect. And it's different in various countries around the world, but I'll just speak for the US. In the US, we have 5 new state laws that are coming online. There's a new California law. There is a new Virginia law taking effect in January 1 of 2023. July 1, we've got 2 more laws, Connecticut and Colorado. We have Utah. There's the ADPPA, which is the U.S. national law that is up for consideration. There's COPPA 2.0, a new children's privacy law that's up for consideration. The FTC has announced rulemaking. So there is just a convergence. And it started with consumers, right? It started with when consumers really took this in and got past the just reflexive accept, right? That was how it all began. But as these stories keep coming out and people realize that how much data sharing is happening through online advertising and through websites they visit, it's caused a significant shift in attitudes. We saw a study by KPMG last year where for the first time, consumers were more worried about data sharing than data theft, right? Which is meaning they're more concerned about retargeting from advertising than they are about data breaches. That's where the lines have crossed, and the regulators have followed. So that's why I think it's a critical issue. And it's a data sharing issue, right? And when I talk about these concepts, the two big ones are online advertising and what's called digital objects, pixels and beacons and widgets that sit on web pages and gather analytics data and other things. Both of these may sell and share data. Programmatic advertising is 90% of all the advertising you see on the web. It's algorithm based, it's automated, and it's there because the more information you can get on someone, the more valuable they are, and the higher the price you can sell that for a marketer. Right? So it's all commercially driven. But it goes beyond just that, because there's national security issues. And again, speaking from the U.S. perspective, that about a year ago, there was a bipartisan group of senators who sent a letter to the ad tech companies saying, hey, this kind of data that's gathered through internet advertising could supercharge the Cambridge Analyticas of the world, the blackmail campaigns, the influence and hacking. And a year later, Google was found to be sharing data with a sanctioned Russian company called RuTarget. So it was more than just speculation. It was found to be actually happening. And TikTok in July admitted to Congress that Chinese employees can access user data, which is a big deal in the US.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to add there that it sounds like the US are putting it on the legislation agenda now, but the EU has already done it with GDPR. I mean, that's been going on. I know South Africa, which is where I'm from and a lot of my listeners are from as well, also has the POPI Act, which they've also, put in place around all of this data privacy issues. And you've mentioned that India and China also. So it's something that is, as you said, happening globally at the moment. We need to be aware. We need to put it on the agenda, and we need to care about people's privacy. That's what it seems to me, if I put it just in very plain language.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up the South African Act, because that's relevant. The POPI Act is very much center to all of this. And yes, GDPR is where it all began. And there's a history. The history goes way back to the profiling that happened to people in World War II. Europe has always been more sensitive to this, and Europe has been especially sensitive to the way the U.S. and the Edward Snowden bombshells, right? How that data was being treated. But yes, it is a global phenomenon without question in every country. I haven't seen an exception of a country that has not paid some attention to this.
So let me ask you this. What do you see as, what is your vision for the future in terms of data protection, security, and all of this? Privacy protection. What is the ideal outcome that we want from all of this? Because there's a lot of legislation, and I'm thinking from a business point of view, there's also a lot of, it's like a bit of a hassle now, all the changes that need to be implemented, and the bureaucracy, and the arduous, changes in systems and compliance and all of that. So where are we? What does it look like in a future where this is happening like it should?
I think there's a couple things. One is, as a business person first, I've always been a fan of limited government, but my attitude on that has changed with a lot of the privacy violations and things. That what I think businesses need to do when they look to the future is number one, to assign a leader to your privacy program, large or small organization, designate someone who's in charge of that. You have to do it under GDPR. You need a data protection officer, but it's also just a good practice.
Okay.
Another really good practice is just mapping the data across your organization and knowing what is where, identifying that, and especially paying attention to personal and sensitive information. In my company, Boltive, we discover every day. In the US, it's about 100 times a day. In Europe, it's about 50 to 70 times per day. There are these things for every individual. You have consent failures. So those cookies, those cookie banners you're talking about where you're clicking accept or you're clicking reject, about a third of the time that signal gets lost and gets mistransmitted because there are so many steps in the internet chain, so many vendors that have to act on that signal. And there's so many different types of signals and protocols that we find a third of the time that signal gets lost, which can be problematic, right? If you think you're opting out and then your data is being shared anyway.
That's very interesting. So I have wondered about that, because if I go, say, opt out of something and I keep getting emails from it, and I think, have they just ignored my messages? Is this on purpose? That does happen.
And that's where it's visible to you, is the emails.
That's where it's visible, exactly.
Right.
What about the invisible stuff, the things that I'm not seeing?
The data that's being shared, and there's codes for ethnicity, political beliefs, there's codes for religion, there's codes for sexual preference, there's codes for health conditions, right? As we start
scary. It's
financial
really scary,
conditions. Because it's so valuable. It's an auction. It's an auction. Whoever knows the most about an individual usually wins that auction and pays the most. And then everybody, which is dozens of ad tech vendors, they make more money as a result. So the system, there is no sheriff. It's a lawless system left to its own, left alone. It's where we've gotten to today, where the more data, the better. The more personal data, the better for the commercial aspects of this. But back to your question about what can we do? So I said sign a leader, number one. Map the data in your organization, number two. Number three is to recognize some of the bad actors here, as I was referencing before, a third of the time consent gets lost. That's created a phenomenon we call dark signals. And it's a signal that just goes dark. Nobody knows whether someone has opted in or not. And then it's up to ethics as to whether we serve, or whether the ad tech companies serve ads or not. There's also a second step, which gets back to this root target, which was this Russian sanctioned entity that was found to be receiving data from consumers in the US and Europe. And that's that they're data skimmers. So what is a data skimmer? It's like when you go to an ATM machine or when you go to a gas pump, you may have heard that there are these little pieces of plastic, little hardware that scammers will put on the card swipe areas to mimic the machine, but it's actually it's its own contained device that grabs your card information and your PIN number.
Yeah, right? I think most people have suffered from that. I know I certainly have.
Yeah, and they're
credit
invisible.
card theft or whatever, but it wasn't, my card wasn't actually stolen. It was just the information.
It was a device.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's skimmers, right? Dark signals and skimmers are the problem out there, and we see skimmers existing because there are these parties that live in the ecosystem of internet advertising that just monitor and watch and hoover up or siphon out the personal data that's flowing back and forth across the buyer of ads and the seller of ads. And it's not hard to get a seat. It's not hard to stay invisible. But that's, as I think about what businesses should watch out for, is there are technologies like Boltives that can help identify when there's these dark signals and when there are these data skimmers, these fraudsters that are gathering data like credit card information for transactions.
So what do you fear? What is your biggest fear for the future? That's what I'd love to know.
Yeah. So if we go way ahead, right, we think about how did we start this whole internet thing? Where did the internet come from and where is it going?
Good question. Right? We don't even know, right? We're just happy to use it.
I think the thing that I fear about is that there's two extremes, right? One is that we do nothing about privacy, and it just goes on. The laws are a small point in time. The pendulum swings the other way, and we're back to this dystopian world that we see in the movies where nothing is private. Yeah. And for a moment, I think that's a low likelihood again, because there's so much pressure from organizations to become more privacy compliant. Right. The other extreme to this is that there's a risk of a boomerang effect. And if you go back to the beginning of the internet, when it was governed by, at least in the US, America Online, CompuServe, there are these walled gardens that existed because it took so much capital to actually access the internet. Well, that was how it was in the late 90s. It's a viable model, but it's way antithetical to the open web that we're used to today. But we're seeing that that data privacy regulations disproportionately burden smaller companies. And so there is also a future where the big technology companies become the walled gardens like AOL and CompuServe were before. That's the other extreme. So I fear kind of either one of those. I think we're going to stay down the middle path. I think there's going to be a lot of debate. There's going to be a lot of arguing from the public and private sector to get this right. But technology vendors, I think, will step in and make it far, far easier and take the burden off of businesses and make it affordable. And that's back to the mission that Boltive has. It's to be there for the brand safe, privacy first digital era, to help companies grow in a privacy compliant way.
Thank you. I mean, I think that is a vision that we can all hold and really want to be part of creating. So yeah, I want to say thank you for Boltive stepping into that space and saying, okay, we can partner with you and help you do this in a way that's maybe not as burdensome as it seems at the moment.
And it's been helpful to see our clients turn around. We have not yet met a client that hasn't had a gap of some kind, but they can become world class and they can not have to worry about GDPR and feel good about how they're taking care of their consumers, not worry about regulations. But it's all part of the ethics I find are making their way into business in a way that hasn't been the same in my career to date. Principles about sustainability that are making their way, social justice, environmental concerns, privacy respect. Those are aspects of business that you used to brush off a decade or two ago, and now they're central to what we do. So I think that's if we want to see what's the positive with the silver lining on all the privacy abuses, it's that business is taking a stand.
Exactly, and it's giving us an opportunity to actually do something about it. It's highlighted a gap, and we need to step into the gap and plug it. Do something.
Yeah. That's what gets me going. That's what keeps me going every day, and I think it's fulfilling for myself, but also for our employees who are working hard every day.
So Dan, I'd love to, as we come to a close, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I really thank you and appreciate you being here and sharing both your personal story and the story of your business and what you're trying to do or what you are doing. I'd love to maybe end with, I like to talk about leadership and leadership habits. So maybe let's go back a little bit to the personal and perhaps share with us what have been some of the leadership habits that you've put in place that you see are absolutely critical and have helped you change your mindset, change the way you do things, and change how you lead your business.
Yeah, great. I think it starts with managing yourself before you can manage a business. And
I love that. That totally resonates with my message. It starts with you, right? It starts with you. Yeah.
And going through a difficult circumstance and realizing every moment counts. Okay. It's more than, we've been fed that. And I've learned that when I've read management books, time management books, and I hear that, I read that over and over again, but it never really sunk in until I had the life experience. It required me to make every moment count, to make every moment count because of the time that I had left with my wife and my boys had left with my wife, but also to make every moment count because as a single parent, right, I've got to make sure I'm getting what needs to be done during the day, so I have the time for them, right, to be the parent for them.
Can you give an example of something that is it, or is it just a more general concept for you? Is there something that you have taken on or something that you do to really feel that, make every moment count? Yeah,
it's when you've got to block time in your day for carpooling, for driving your kids where they need to be, right? And how's dinner going to get on the table? How are they going to get their work done? So that what kind of systems can you put together, right? So that your kids are getting their work done without you having to pester them. But I think on the parenting side, and interestingly, the pandemic, I will say, helped this along for us because everybody was reset to the same point, which is being homebound. But business and home just flows together. It's all intertwined. There's no stop work, get off work, ring the bell, and you're a parent. It's all intertwined. Right. So finding, and that becomes a multi-dimensional aspect of time management. So I got a lot better at that. But back to, start with yourself and managing the things that you need to cordon off in your life. Then it's how can you manage your business and what systems can you apply there? And I found that the OKR system has been really, really important to
Great.
implement the objectives and the key results. And we do that every quarter. These are, if people, your listeners that may not be familiar with that, you're setting up quarterly or sometimes biennial goals that have key results or metrics that you're seeking to achieve. But the objectives are like little missions. And there's the things that grab you by the heart and say, yes, we're going to go climb that mountain, right? We're going to go scale that mountain. So having a set of 1 to 2 objectives every quarter, and having a set of
make your objectives connected to your mission or part of your key mission, something that really aligns with who you are and what you're trying to do in this world. So it's kind of make it meaningful. That's what I'm hearing. Okay.
Make it meaningful. It's because different people respond to different things and different people are motivated. Some, the more creative types, they want to embrace the mission. Those that are more sort of left brain, they want to say, okay, what are we achieving? What are the numbers?
What are the results? And have some results or metrics associated with that. Yeah.
And so you need both, but follow up is key. Follow, like anything in life, you can't just set it and forget it, because then January 17th rolls around and you've already moved on. but the follow up, right? So every week in our management meetings, we go through the OKRs and are we green, yellow, or red? And we score ourselves. Are we 0? We're not going to hit it. Are we 10? It's a slam dunk. And challenging yourself that the goal is not to be a 10. The goal is really to be about a 6 or 7 in your OKRs. Because if you're higher than that, you're sandbagging. You're not trying hard enough. If you're lower than that, you're probably demoralizing the organization. But if you're around a 6 or 7, which can be hard to swallow, because many of us think of our grades in school, we want to be 8s and 9s, right? But a 6 or 7 is about where an organization should be, to make sure you're stretched.
Because it's a measure of progress. It's a measure of where are we at on this journey, rather than a kind of a black and white, have we achieved it or haven't we? Because it's recognizing that there's a process here, not just we're there or we're not there. There's a whole lot in between.
And I think in the last, that's well said. And the last point I would say, which I have to work on myself a lot, is to open yourself up to more and more feedback. Because when you are a leader in an organization, it's very easy, because it's an asymmetric bet when your direct reports are given a chance to give you feedback or not give you feedback. And this is something that Matt Moshari says, that if you're a CEO and you're asking an individual for feedback, the asymmetry is, well, if I give the CEO this feedback, what are they going to do with it? If they do something positive, that's a plus 10. But if I give the CEO the feedback and then they hate me for it because I've really hit something, then it's a minus 100, right? And now I've really put my career
at risk. It's a big risk,
So your direct reports, as much as you think, they do not want to give you feedback. It is a bad bet to give you feedback.
As I say, CLM sometimes, in some environments, CLM is a career limiting move.
It's a career limiting move. So how do you reinforce with your employees over and over again that the absence of feedback is going to hold the organization back? And how, when someone gives you feedback, you deeply listen to that and acknowledge it and appreciate it. And you don't always act on it, not 100% of the time. But to really know that the employee is being heard, and that you're internalizing it, and that you're open to that, to lower that risk and to shift that bet towards more about giving more feedback.
I love that. And that's such a good point for us to really remember and hold on to, because actually, to create a culture of openness where people give each other feedback, and you can give feedback to a CEO, it's all in your response. How does the CEO or the manager respond to the feedback? Because the first time it will be hard, and they'll be testing you, and they'll, maybe be very neutral and vanilla and whatever. And then if you ask again, it's a process. It's something you've got to keep doing and keep reinforcing. And you ask again, and you ask again. And then someone dares to give something a little bit critical, and you don't blow a fuse, and you actually accept it and you take it on. And as you say, it doesn't mean that you have to act on every item of feedback. But what you really, really do need to do is listen. Take it in. You can ask questions for clarification if you're not sure exactly, what it's about or what it looks like, but listen. Don't even respond. Take it in, listen, and decide what you're going to do. And I think that's a big leadership lesson, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, to resist the temptation to respond.
Exactly. To respond, to defend, to explain. No, just take it in, listen. As I say, you can ask a question, but besides for that, it's also okay to say thank you and let it sink in. Decide what you want to do with it.
I love what you said, because by the way, what you said is not just true in business. It's great in your personal life. Try that at home with your spouse or significant other, right? And you'll find your relationship.
Right. So true. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Very, very true. I love it. Thank you, Dan. I've really enjoyed our time together. Any parting words or something you'd love to leave us with before we say goodbye?
Gosh. Well, thank you for this time, Daphne. I think it's good. It's cathartic to talk through life experience, and also to bring it back to what hopefully it's something that's useful to your users or your consumers, your listeners. I'm available if people want to talk about any of the topics that I've covered here. My email is dan@boltive.com, and it's BOLTIVE. If you're going through the cancer journey yourself, or if you want to learn more about privacy, that's a great way to reach me. I'm also on LinkedIn, Dan Frechtling, if anybody want to take this conversation further. But thank you for your time. I know your time is valuable, and you choose your guests. You're very discriminating about who your guests are. So thank you for allowing me to.
It's true. How do you know that, by the way? It's true. But yeah, thank you for coming on. I just think this has been an incredible conversation, both from a personal, mindset shifting conversation, connecting conversation, to this really important topic of data security and privacy, and just getting a little bit more understanding around that. So I really appreciate your time. We will put all of that information in the show notes as well, your contact details and whatever. Feel free to connect with Dan, and just again, appreciating you and your time.
Yep, all the best. Thanks so much, Daphne.